It was Friday, July 4th, 1889. The heat had been oppressive all day, and the evening brought no relief. A woman named Mrs. Chris had a neighbor keeping her company, and the two friends, hoping for the occasional cooling breeze, decided to sit on the front porch while they talked. The hour grew late, and a full moon illuminated everything for miles around. Just past 11 p.m., the neighbor stopped rocking in her chair and peered into the distance. "What's that on the road?" she asked. Mrs. Chris stood up and walked to the weathered porch railing to get a better look. "Wagons," she replied, "from the old fort." She spoke with a certain amount of disbelief, for Fort de Chartres, near the Chris home, was little more than a ruin. No one ever had business there, let alone at such a late hour. As the procession grew closer, the silhouettes became clearer and clearer in the bright moonlight. The women counted 40 wagons in total, followed by 13 pair of horsemen and a number of people soberly trailing behind the cavalcade on foot. Near the front of the procession was a single low dray. It carried what appeared in the light of the moon to be a casket. A little farther down the road there was indeed a small cemetery. Mrs. Chris and her neighbor realized at once that they were witnessing a funeral procession. How strange for a funeral to be taking place in the middle of the night! The women could not recall hearing of a death in the area, and it still made no sense that the cortege seemed to be coming from the crumbling fort. Furthermore, although the night was bright, it was odd that not one person in the procession carried a lamp. Mrs. Chris and her friend puzzled over the peculiar situation in hushed tones. When they stopped speaking for a few moments, the greatest mystery of all became apparent. The funeral cortege was entirely silent. The women watched in astonishment as wagon wheels ground and bumped along the rough dirt road and horses' hoofs raised clouds of dust in the hot air. Not a sound could be heard. People in the procession appeared to speak to one another, but there was no voices. The night was all but still. Its silence was broken only by the yelping of the family dog, which became increasingly agitated as it watched the eerie parade. The next morning, the women discovered that they had not been alone in witnessing the ghostly spectacle. The dog's barking had wakened the neighbor's father, and he had risen to see what the fuss was. From his bedroom window, he too had watched the inexplicable procession, and was able to verify everything the women had seen. And so, Mrs. Chris and her friend were convinced that they had not been hallucinating. Still, they had no idea what it was they had seen until several days later, when a visitor who was well versed in the history of Fort de Chartres heard their strange story. The visiting women told them of something that had happened roughly 100 years earlier, when the fort was still occupied by the French. A prominent local merchant was killed in a fight with one of the officers of the garrison, and fort officials were unsure how they should handle such a scandalous and potentially volatile situation. They sought advice from the regional government and received it. The victim was to be buried quietly at midnight in a local cemetery. Only the light of the moon would be used to show the way. Mrs. Chris and her friend listened attentively to the account. By the end of it, they were certain that this was what they had seen on the strange, sweltering night was a spectral reenactment of the funeral that took place a century before. Although there are no other well-documented sightings of the phantom funeral procession, it is said that whenever July 4th falls on a Friday, the ghostly wagons will roll out. By some accounts, there must also be a full moon in the sky. Furthermore, only 3 people are ever permitted to witness the scene at once. Those who wish to test the legend should take note that the next Fridays to fall on July 4th will be in the years 2003, 2014, and 2025. Look for a full moon on those nights. Take 2